this whole system where you get funding from either government grants or private grants, and then you publish in an academic journal that sort of doesn't give everyone access to your publishing. How can we use things like quadratic funding in order to fund sciences? It doesn't stop within Web3. Any city, any state, any country, any Reddit subreddit could deploy quadratic funding or something like Gitcoin grants to regenerate its local economy. So you start with this grounds up groundswell of communities regenerating themselves, and then the sum of that is a big movement towards regeneration.
About our current financial system.
Today, NEWFORUM is honored to have as a guest Kevin Owocki, Regen OG, founder of Gitcoin and supermodeler, internet citizen, and chaos magician, among other things. So we will discuss about the Web3 and crypto ethos, regen economy, trust, and his overall thoughts as we get ready for 2023. Welcome, Kevin, and let's start if you're ready.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks so much for having me. Excited for the conversation.
Our pleasure. So most OGs came to the space as cypherpunks, advocating privacy, strong cryptography. You yourself mentioned on the Bankless podcast that you also have solarpunk values, so believing in a future where humanity has solved its major contemporary issues. We also have the lunarpunks that thrive more in uncertainty. So to better understand where we are today, what are the differences and similarities between these movements, and where do you place yourself?
So basically the cypherpunk movement was a movement in the 90s that advocated for strong cryptography as a means of protecting not just our digital rights, but all sorts of human rights. And so it's the basis of that movement that I think a lot of the ethos of the Web3 community around privacy, particularly like the use of strong cryptography, comes from. And so that's one vector of values that I think that the space has. I've come to really respect and love the use of cryptography. I mean, you're basically just using math in order to protect your rights and protect your communications. And I think that there's something really beautiful about that as sort of a birthright, that we have math that we can invent and use for our ends. I've traditionally been more on the left, and politically that means that I'm focused on things like sustainability, solving problems with environmental and social good, and the sort of punk moniker that I've seen develop over the last couple of years is this thing called Solarpunk. So basically, how do we solve our contemporary problems around sustainability with an emphasis on climate and also planetary resources? And that's the Solarpunk movement. So basically, it's an art movement that imagines what the world would look like if we solve our contemporary problems with basically our relation to the environment, but also to each other from a economic and social justice perspective. So I think that it's the intersection of these two things where Web3 gets really interesting, because now we can solve some of these problems by programming our values into our money and building peer-to-peer monetary economies. And so what would it look like if we helped solve some of our sustainability problems with markets instead of using the state? I think is the design space that we've been playing in here. But so this isn't just theoretical. This isn't just me waxing philosophical.
Yeah,
I'm a builder. I'm a software engineer, and I guess I'm mostly known for founding Gitcoin, which is kind of putting some of these ideas into practice. Has funded $72 million worth of open source software and pro-social stuff and stuff. So it's part theory and part practice.
What are your thoughts when it comes to the kind of lunarpunk movement that kind of criticizes the solarpunk, saying that it's a bit naive, that it's not like ready for the unpredictability of the world? Can you be a cypherpunk at the same time as solarpunk and at the same time like looking for profit? Or are you more obsessed about the technology? Like, where do you position yourself, and where do you see these different kind of movements coming together? Are they completely different, or can they intersect?
Yeah, great question. I think that there's been this band of punk that's done a good job of marketing itself, and it calls itself Lunarpunk. And by the way, keep in mind that these are not mainstream things, so there's not general consensus definitions of what they are. My primary complaint about the Lunarpunk movement is that they keep on saying things about the Solarpunk movement that the Solarpunk movement wouldn't ascribe to themselves. I can't tell you how many interactions I've had on Twitter where people who run the Lunarpunk banner say, "Oh, Solarpunks don't care about privacy," and then myself and other people who identify as Solarpunks say, "Well, we do care about privacy," and it's it's like it doesn't stick, and so. I mean, I think the most generous interpretation of that is that they're not hearing us. But I think that, when you look at it from a realpolitik perspective, they're trying to establish privacy as one of the most important values up the stack, even above environmental and social good, and which is not something that I would say I would even disagree with. And since the Solarpunk movement has gained a lot of steam, there's a way of sort of siphoning the mimetic energy there by defining the larger movement in a way that paints your movement in a more positive light. But like, hey, at the end of the day, I would consider myself to be a cypherpunk, to be a lunarpunk, and also to be a solarpunk. And so, I think that these movements are like 99.9% share the same values in DNA. You could look at it as like cypherpunk, lunarpunk, solar. I know this is a video podcast, but for the audio listeners, I'm just making hand motions. They're all on the right side of my screen. And then there's like the statist sort of like bureaucracies, which are like all the way on the other side of things. And I think that Solarpunk, Lunarpunk, and Cypherpunk are so close to each other that there's not as much daylight as you would have, as you would think.
Most of the newcomers in crypto during the bull run don't necessarily have this understanding of the cypherpunk movement, the solarpunk movement. Do you think there's a need to understand it? Or do you think that it's more like as you explore and you discover the space, you get interested? Or you think they don't need to understand it as long as they start adopting the technologies around it?
I think it really just depends on who you are and what you're trying to use the technology for. We can program our values into our money. So what kind of monetary systems do we want to be involved in? If you're abusive and manipulative, you can build Ponzi schemes. If you care about environmental social good, you can build that. If you care about strong cryptography, you can build those systems. And so there's no way of saying like, I'm just one actor and I would never project on the entire space. Like the whole space needs to do X. It's really about the people who are coming into the space, what job they're trying to be doing, and whether or not the system guides them towards doing that job. So I guess I'm not really answering your question, but I do think that there's no, this space is like really has a wide aperture and is diffuse, and it's like really hard to generalize about the whole space, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Although my next question will take kind of a generalization, I apologize. And I know you meant this as a joke, but you said 2022 is the year of degen and 2023 is kind of the year of regen. So I'd like to take one of your quotes, which is through conversation plus community, by channeling more attention, talent, and capital into a regen Web3, we can create a gravity well towards regen Web3. Could you briefly describe what regen is and also kind of discuss this quote and why do you think 2023 will be a defining year?
Yeah, I mean, I think each year is defining because we're laying layers of sediment in this space. And so regen is basically the idea of a resource capacity that increases over time. It's regenerating resource capacity over time. And degeneration is decreasing resource capacity over time. And this can be like a long, slow, steady increase or decrease, or it can be a sudden shock. Like, for example, the collapse of Terra Luna and the collapse of FTX is systemic fragility to the space. And so you can have like immediate degeneracy and you can have a long, slow decline. And so basically the idea behind regen is like, what if our resource capacity increased over time? And then, the sort of like adjacent idea to this is like not just talking about financial resources. So my friend Gregory Landua, who is a thinker and a founder of the Regen Network, talks about the 8 different types of capital. So spiritual capital, cultural capital, intellectual capital, of which this podcast is probably a type of intellectual capital, by the way. Material capital, living capital, which is like regenerating the biosphere or carbon, climate change. I'm not remembering all 8 forms of capital off the top of my head, but
forms of intelligence. There's a story.
Yeah, but the idea is like not just increasing resource capacity of financial capital, but also material capital and spiritual capital and intellectual capital. And so it's really about what kind of monetary system do we want to build? Is financial capital the end all be all, or is it a means towards the other types of capital? And so basically exploding the design space out from one dimension to those 8 dimensions, and then also saying, hey, let's build systems that regenerate over time, is the idea behind the regenerative crypto economic movement, at least how I would define it. And by the way, I wrote a book called Green Pill, which, is all about how crypto could regenerate the world. I don't think that it's happening yet. That's why the book is subtitled How Crypto Could Regenerate the World. I hope that by 2026, I can write the book How Crypto is Regenerating the
Well, we're
World.
laying the foundations, as you mentioned, right? This brings us actually to the next point, and this is one of the main focuses of the Green Pill podcast, which is really how do we make kind of regen economy investable? You've had many guests on to discuss this topic. One of them, for example, is Ivan Meyazano, so head of research at Protocol Labs, that discuss impact certificates. Obviously, through these different episodes, you've heard lots of different thoughts. I wanted to hear really what you thought about impact certificates, this idea that Ivan mentions around kind of not really gamification, but educating and showing awareness to the topic. So what are your thoughts on how do we make it investable, this topic? How do we raise awareness around it? Not just like on podcasts on a cultural level, but really on a broader scale level.
Yeah, I mean, well, so the first thing I'll say is that I'm not spearheading the movement. I'm just like one channel through which some of the memes flow through. And, I fell ass backwards into founding Gitcoin, which was building regen stuff. And our audience was developers and people in the space. So we're just like 5 years ahead of everyone else because we serve developers. And it just so happens that everyone needs developers in the space, right? So I think that I'm just early is what it is. And, it depends on the market segment. You're like quadratic funding in Gitcoin is already happening now. There's other market segments like, how do we do Sybil resistant identity is an important one. And that's sort of happening with proof of humanity and Bright ID and WorldCoin. There's how do we capture carbon, which is externalizing, and that market subsegment is like, there's stuff happening there. Is it at the point where we're going to avert climate change as a human civilization? No, not yet. And so like regenerative Web3 is this broad umbrella that we're creating, but there's many little sub-segments in it. Decentralized science right now is one that's pretty hot. And I think it's because a lot of people in science are fed up with academic funding bureaucracies.
What is decentralized science?
I mean, it's just basically science that's trying to get away from the traditional funding and publishing intermediaries. So, this whole system where you get funding from either government grants or private grants, and then you publish in an academic journal that sort of doesn't give everyone access to your publishing. How can we use things like quadratic funding in order to fund science is kind of the subject matter there, and Gitcoin grants is experimenting with finding funding infrastructure for that.
On that matter of Gitcoin, it's true that I think, tell me if I'm wrong, but Gitcoin is just closing a round of grantees with UNICEF Innovate. So what are your thoughts on this? Like, is this like a step forward that, or you're starting to bring more major organizations on this new topic that they don't necessarily know much about?
Yeah, that's starting to happen. I mean, the other main story behind Gitcoin right now is that the protocol that I built in 2019 was centralized and monolithic. And Gitcoin's just finished up turning the corner from becoming a DAO and being a decentralized modular protocol. And so the UNICEF round, which just happened, and I think around $100,000 was raised in it, was an experiment not only with partnering with UNICEF, but also an experiment with running a decentralized modular, credibly neutral Gitcoin grants. And so that was quite exciting for Gitcoin DAO to turn that corner. But, I'm saying our vision, but, I've disaffiliated from Gitcoin DAO because a DAO doesn't have a CEO, and I think I had too much soft power over there. But, my sort of vision is that Gitcoin and the grants registry could be deployed. Right now, Vitalik calls it a pillar of the Ethereum ecosystem, but there's no reason quadratic funding couldn't be deployed to any DAO, any layer 1, any layer 2, any NFT project could use quadratic funding to organize its community. But it doesn't stop within Web3. Any city, any state, any country, any Reddit subreddit could deploy quadratic funding or something like Gitcoin grants to regenerate its local economy. So you start with this groundswell of communities regenerating themselves, and then the sum of that is a big movement towards regeneration. So That's kind of the strategy with Gitcoin grants. And yeah, I mean, UNICEF is just a great example of a forward-thinking organization that is willing to leverage it.
And so, I mean, I would say one of the core pillars or components when it comes to Gitcoin is trust. Everyone trusts Gitcoin for its deserve for what it's accomplished. But when you look at the broader landscape of crypto and Web3, and you've mentioned FTX earlier, and there's many other examples that we could give. How can we build more trust in the space? Because if you talk to people that are not in crypto, the first thing that comes to mind is scams, can't trust. I just heard about FTX. What is Bitcoin, etc.
Yeah.
So obviously, we want to cater first to the people that are dedicated in the space, that are building the tech, before we kind of broaden our horizons. But there is a massive issue when it comes to user experience and building this trust. So what is your take on legitimacy and trust in the space in general?
Yeah, well, Gitcoin, like I said, I built it centralized and monolithic in the start, and there's too much trust in that because you had to trust that Kevin Owocki's not in the back fiddling the dials towards his favorite projects. You can't have a centralized pillar of a decentralized ecosystem. And so basically, we've gone on a mission at Gitcoin to reduce the amount that people have to trust people like me in order to use Gitcoin. Also, there's a bunch of bugs in the software that I wrote. I'm not that good of a software engineer. We had to rewrite it from scratch because of that.
Okay,
so
good to know.
So I mean, I think that building internet ecosystems where you don't have to trust someone, with Gitcoin Grants 2.0, you could just fork it and run it in your own community. And I think that that's great. The problem with Sam Bankman-Fried was that he accrued too much social capital and trust, and he abused that because he basically was using customer funds to make the FTX arena and spend on all this crazy stuff. For core infrastructure, you don't want to have to trust it. In my human relationships day to day, if we're building rapport and we're friends, there's a certain amount of trust that's inherent in that, and I think that that's totally healthy. But for internet infrastructure that we need to be credibly neutral and we need to be decentralized, I think it's a bad idea to have trust. So I almost go upstream to your question. And I think that the question for me is what is the use case and what is the relationship between us? And then we can decide whether we want more of a trustless architecture or a trustful architecture. And for friendships and for communities, I think it's important to have trust. But for core infrastructure that could be abused, I don't think it's as much of a good idea. So maybe I'm not answering your question, but that's how I think about it.
But you mentioned social capital, right? That Sam had too much social capital. So
yeah,
is that a bad thing? Do you think that we should actually use the tech because it's kind of incredibly neutral? But you can't stop people from having social capital as they're more involved in the space, right? I mean, you yourself, you could argue you have a lot of social capital and you're doing good with it, but that's not something we can really control, right? So how does that play in?
Well, if I could pay my bills in social capital, I'd be a billionaire. So I mean, I think it just really depends on the situation. So Vitalik wrote this great blog post about how DAOs differ from corporations. And he said that decentralization is important for credible fairness. Decentralization is important for censorship resistance, and it's better for making decisions in environments where groups of people making decision by consensus is better. So in those scenarios, you want to have trustlessness. So if you want credible fairness, if you have a public goods funding infrastructure like Gitcoin, you want to not have to trust anyone. You just want to be able to prove that the inputs created the outputs and there's no one fiddling the dials in the back. Decentralization for censorship resistance, I think applies in the Sam Bankman-Fried case where basically you had to trust that he wasn't misappropriating your funds. And that's a big problem with banks and centralized exchanges, particularly offshore ones where you don't have a remedy via the legal system. But, I think that outside of those criteria where Vitalik identified that decentralization is important, it's fine to trust people and it's healthy to trust people. I trust my wife, I trust my kids, I trust my friends in Colorado. And so it just depends on the situation, I think.
Right. So, but when you trust people, what are your thoughts when it comes to badges? Because I don't have the exact quote of Vitalik, but recently, I wouldn't say he was criticizing him, but he was observing that, when it came to governance and DAOs, tokens were not necessarily always the best way to proceed. So when it comes to reputation and using badges, verifiable credentials, do you think that's the right way forward? That you can trust that someone that worked more on a specific project or that has the experience should have more voting power, more influence within a group? Do you think that's the direction we're taking, or we're more at an experimental stage and we're not really sure if it's going to be government tokens, verifiable credentials in the forms of badges, etc.?
Yeah, really great question. So, I mean, decentralized identity and reputation is a whole multi-dimensional design space. And I've thought most about this thing called Sybil resistance, which is just basically telling one human from another and weeding out the bots. And so I can't speak for the entire space, but when I think about decentralized society, I think of, I sent you a POAP that we did a podcast together. And what I think about there is two things. Like when I zoom out and I think about a world where everyone's sending each other POAPs and sending each other verifiable credentials, the directed graph that happens between all of humanity, where I'm saying I'm making X attestation about you, and you're making Y attestation about Alice, and she's making Z attestation about Bob, and it's that graph and that web of trust that kind of becomes interesting, and basically, what can you say about each edge of the graph? Well, it's got a from person, it's got a to person, and there's some context with the POAP that I sent you. In the case that I said earlier, I was sending you a POAP that said that we did a podcast together. That might be useful in some scenarios for figuring out your identity, but it might also be not useful outside of that context. Also, if you don't trust me as the sender, then or you don't have any idea about my reputation as a sender, then it's hard to glean any ideas out of that. So basically, I think that web of trust is a really interesting model for maybe building up an idea of how much social capital each person in this space has. Web of trust is like what PageRank is based off of in Google, where you have basically Larry and Sergey. What they figured out was that every link from one web page to another web page is a vote of the trustworthiness of that other web page. And if you assign a certain amount of social capital to all of the web page and you just let it flow through that web of trust, then that's how you get PageRank. And I think it's going to be a similar sort of thing with decentralized society and with verifiable credentials, where you let the social capital flow through it in a PageRank type algorithm. I don't know that I'm totally answering your question, but those are some thoughts that I have around identity.
It makes sense. I actually did an episode with Michael Senna, one of the founders of Ceramic Network.
Oh, Ceramic, yeah.
And
we were integrated with them.
And well, yeah, actually, I think he mentioned a lot of Gitcoin actually during the episode.
Yeah.
And well, I mean, obviously, and it was funny because he was mentioning really the plug and play into the graph and the concept of like having a more intimate internet. That's really why he got into the space. And with regards to verifiable credentials, there's always this idea of trust, but also of having this decentralized identity, like because it's more intimate, you're more in control of your identity, you can trust it more. But obviously that we're still building these blocks. So I think you answered my question with regards to that and what previous guests probably said. As we start approaching the end of the episode, I wanted to ask you, what are your kind of guilty pleasures when it comes to Web3? You cannot answer public goods or Gitcoin. Sorry. There's some random facts, right? If you go on the Supermodeler website that, you were a 5th grade chess champion, things like that. So what are your guilty pleasures when it's not public goods? Like, I don't know, it could be NFTs, DeFi, gaming, running.
Yeah, I am a runner. I don't consider that to be one of my vices, though. It is a way I unwind after being in front of the computer, and like I'll just turn to the side here, and I have like a bunch of back issues from just being in front of the computer all day, and so doing yoga and being physically active and running and hiking is something that I love to do outside of work. I live in Colorado, which is one of the most beautiful places in the world, in my opinion. And, just communing with nature is something that I do once a day or twice a day at least. But, when I moved to Colorado, I thought I'd be spending like backpacking through the mountains. And it turns out I'm just working on the internet a lot. But that's because I love what I do.
Before you continue on the guilty pleasure side, it's true. It is surprising that unless you know of some, that there's not like mental health DAOs in the space, like it's such a huge component of like keeping the right balance in life and like exercises. Do you know of any like kind of mental health DAOs slash, like anything like for mental health or like just living wellness, you could put it that way?
No, I at Gitcoin we've had like people come in and do like guided meditations and talk about mental health and burnout and stuff like that. So we've had guest speakers that come in that will do subjects on it, but I haven't seen any mental health DAOs specifically. I do think it's an important thing as a founder and someone who's been through multi cycles to manage your own psychology And my way that I do that is like I run, I stay physically active, I do yoga, I spend time with my friends and family. I play a lot of like in between meetings, like after this meeting, if we break early, I'll probably like play a game of chess on my phone just to unwind, or like play a
I
game
thought
of
you were gonna
StarCraft
say
or something like that.
you were gonna say a game of League of Legends like Sam. I was gonna be
Yeah,
not the
I
best.
haven't gotten into League of Legends, but I've played some Warcraft, and I understand that League of Legends is like an alt of Warcraft, like one of the custom games that you can play. So
Yeah, it's
yeah,
very
but
popular.
I should check that out. Although I guess no one's trying to emulate Sam Bankman-Fried at this point. So
Well, I mean, maybe you could organize like a chess tournament for public goods, you know? I'm sure if you streamed it, if you figured out with someone from the Gitcoin team and you contacted streamers, you could actually raise a lot of awareness around public goods, chess, and
yeah,
crypto in general. So going back to the
yeah,
guilty pleasure. So, okay, chess. I mean, I play chess too. I'm not sure we can say it's a guilty pleasure. It's a
yeah.
nice hobby to have.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Yeah, I mean it's like what are the pleasures, and I don't know how many of them are like actually truly vices. But yeah, I think it's just like important to manage your own psychology, and that, for me that's what's upstream from all of this stuff. And like the other thing that I'll say is that like people attach certain things to you based off of your reputation, and like one of the things that's been interesting for me as Gitcoin has started is that people attach all these different like virtues to me because I'm like the public goods guy or something like that. But like I'm just like this flawed, like regular guy, like anyone else. And so I need time to unwind. I get stressed out. I get short tempered when I've had a long day at work, also. And so it's really like you just got to manage your psychology and have a long term time horizon, I think. And that's what like for me playing chess or StarCraft or running is about, is like having hobbies outside of Web3. The space can be all consuming, and it's better to, I think, dip your toes in here and there and have a long-term time horizon.
For sure. I mean, this brings us to the last question, although you kind of answered it, which was like kind of the final thoughts and what inspires you in the space. Is there something else that you would like to add that wasn't asked, or something that inspired you lately? It could be a person, a project, an article, a family.
I'm really excited about this idea that we can program our values into our money, and there's just some really smart people in the space that care so much. Like you said Michael Cena came on from Ceramic, and he's awesome because he's really trying to build a world in which you can leverage your reputation and make an income with it and build community with it. I'm inspired by the Optimism team, not only because of their technical ability, but because they care so much about public good. I'm inspired by the protocol developers and how they are maintaining this global economic network, this state machine that is Ethereum. I'm excited by people like that are working on Regen stuff and Web3 stuff. I just think that there's so much innovation in this space, and I'm just inspired by anyone who has a vision and is trying to pull it into reality by playing long-term infinite games. And there's a lot of people in this space that are doing that. So it's a great place. It's a great thing to wake up and to work on this every day. I'm like, pinch me. I'm so happy to be working with so many smart, talented people on these great things.
These are great final thoughts. It actually reminds me of, I don't know if you know the cookie game, but a very smart and stupid game at the same time, where you just click on a cookie and it just keeps growing and you have more and more cookies. So it's kind of like the infinite game of the more you do it, the better it gets and the bigger it gets.
Nice. I'll have to check that out.
Well, it's not really a game, but it's more just a fun concept that like just
Okay.
everyone started playing it because you just click on it, it grows bigger and bigger and bigger, and you can buy stuff to make it grow faster. Anyways,
Oh, cool.
thank you so much, Kevin, for being part of today's episode. Obviously, links to you and the Supermodeler and Gitcoin will be in the description. If you want to get more involved in our community, make sure to follow us on our social platforms. So on Twitter, it's NEWFORUM_NCO. As usual, take a moment. Don't forget to share or like or subscribe to our channel. It's very appreciated. Thank you again, Kevin, and have a great day, everyone.
Thanks for having me. This was fun.